Katie Chicquette Adams. I live in Appleton, Wisconsin. I have for a long time. I lived in Milwaukee for a while, but moved back to Appleton to continue my career as a teacher. I teach at Appleton Central Alternative High School, which is a place for 16 to 20-year-olds who need something different than they had at the big traditional high school, and have been there for about 10 years. It's within that time that I've started writing more actively, getting back to the version of myself as a writer that I think I hoped I would be when I graduated from college. And that has led me to the Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets, which I got into through the group Poetry Unlocked in Appleton, which is run by a bunch of Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets members. And so that's my main, that's my monthly go-to for keeping myself connected to other writers. And I went to the first conference for the Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets this past fall. So I'm new to all of that, but really enjoying it. And it's been very engaging and inspiring. And last night I was at a Poetry Unlocked event at the Draw, and someone, I don't know if it was Sarah or Kathy Kofel, who said, you know, the main thing we want to do here is have fellowship, you know, is be together. And it is such an enjoyable group of people to be with, not least of which is because of their interesting poetry and poems that you get to hear, but just because of who they are and how they talk to each other. And so that has really kept me going as I've tried to continue becoming a person who can accurately call themselves a poet. I don't think it's fair to say I've been writing it intentionally or formally for more than a few years. In fact, I think never really saw myself as a person who wrote poems or would write poems. When I left college, I was writing mostly essays and maybe some short fiction. And I had a professor at UW Milwaukee who really pushed me. He said, you know, you have to keep developing this side of yourself. And I was like, okay. And then I promptly was like, never mind, and went on living my life, you know, in other ways, in which included, you know, getting my first teaching jobs in Milwaukee and getting married and having kids and all of those things. And so it was really a kind of a confluence of things a few years ago that suddenly flipped that switch on inside of me, a switch I didn't really know was even there, to be honest. One of the things was my friend Tara Polcati starting Story Catchers in Appleton and kind of pulling me into that project, and it just lit up that center of my brain, that creative thinking and writing center of my brain that hadn't been engaged as much in previous years. And I also had students that were trying to write some really interesting things and were writing some really interesting things. And those two things together kind of just pushed me forward towards just a new side of myself that I hadn't really used before. And some of the experiences I was having, I don't really know how to explain why, but I just started to think about them in shorter form, you know, the shorter form that poetry can sometimes be. And some of them were really weighty things, you know, like processing the years-long, you know, grief of my mom's passing and other people passing in my life. It's a little bit dark to say, well, death inspired me to poetry, but it kind of did. I mean, my mom died, and then I've had, you know, unfortunately, a number of students pass away over the years, and I'm teaching a creative writing class right now, with two creative writing classes at my school, and a bunch of, I haven't pushed any of them towards poetry, but they've all just been rushing towards it, which is great. One of them said, you know, what was the first poem you wrote? Can you remember the first poem you wrote? And I'm not positive I'm right about it, but one of the first poems that I really intentionally sat down to write was about, you know, after going to a former student's funeral. He passed away just from, you know, a speeding accident. He wasn't intoxicated, it wasn't nighttime, he just was a notorious speeder and a notorious not seatbelt wearer. And I just thought, we're not supposed to do this. We're not supposed to be at funerals for young people. And just the line, we shouldn't have to go to funerals for the young, just kept kind of repeating in my head. And I just needed to kind of get that out of my head, and everything that extended after it, I thought, hey, look, that's actually a poem. And so it all of those things together just made me go, well, there's something here. You know, there's more to this than I realized. And probably the final thing that sort of opened up, which is really minor, it's not like some big event, but I had this realization, I don't have to get every poem I read. I don't have to like every poem I read. And I thought, oh, like all this time, I think I had this big pressure on myself that, you have to get it, and you have to be able to read between the lines, and you have to be, incredibly clever. And I mean, I'm sure that doesn't hurt to be incredibly clever in any, arts-based thing you do, but I suddenly felt really freed by the idea that there's poetry I can like, there's poetry I can say no thanks, and that's true of even the things I write for myself. So all of that together just kind of functioned as this pivot in my path as a person who had been reading a lot and who had been helping kids learn to write in other ways for many years. And just from that point on, it just became something that was like a snowball rolling down the hill. It just kind of kept gathering layers and just kept going, and it's just kept going since then.
Becoming more of a part of you.
Yeah, a huge part of me. I mean, I read a lot as a kid, and I could rattle off all the writers that I read as a kid, and my dad was always reading, so I always had to be reading everything he was reading. So like if he was reading medieval fantasy by Stephen Lawhead, I had to be reading medieval fantasy by Stephen Lawhead. If he was reading Stephen King, I had to be reading Stephen King, which meant I was reading The Dark Half at like 5th grade summer camp and terrified in the middle of the night, which was so inappropriate, but really useful, for a writer brain. When I got, older and out of high school, I was really wowed by Ray Bradbury's writing, especially in Fahrenheit 451, because that stream of consciousness description of both what's happening in real time for the characters, but also what's happening kind of internally for them, was just super fascinating to me. So, in a kind of a way back sense, that's the name that pops into my mind. But right now, poets that I'm really interested in are Francesca Bell, Megan Merchant, Devin Ballwit, who I've become pen and paper pen pals with, which just totally cracks me up because I don't like writing by hand. I've had to kind of like force myself to get better at it and embrace it. She just put a post in one of those closed Facebook groups for people who had all been published in the same thing and said, hey, I want to be a pen pal. Anybody want to? And I don't know what possessed me to say, me, I do. And we've now been writing letters to each other for like almost 2 years. And
wow.
And she writes she's a prolific producer of poems, and I love them. I'm really fascinated by her way of taking like a really subtle domestic tension and playing it out into a page or two of poems. And so I'm really fascinated by those writers. The two names that were in my head as I came over here today were probably unsurprisingly Ellen Court and Carla Houston, who are big names, right? Big names in Wisconsin, being poet laureates, Ellen Court being the first Wisconsin poet laureate. But what connects me to them, other than their talent and their role in that capacity, is that I know them in non-poet ways. And so to see people that are, everyday people in my life and times, you saying, okay, now this is who I am too, though. This is what I'm also doing, and I'm taking it seriously, and I can do it well. That was very inspiring to me. Carla's my neighbor, which is really fun because we're like howdy neighbors, as we walk our dogs. We worked together at Neenah High School for a year. I babysat her kids a couple of times, way back in the day. And I say those things not to be like, look at how I know this lady, but because I knew her all these other ways. And then when she would speak openly about coming to poetry, it hasn't been a part of her life her whole life. It's been something she came to partway through and also ran with it and kind of broke open a new part in her. That encouraged me and reminded me, you don't get like tapped on by the muse fairies who say, okay, now you get to go be a poet. You can just do it if you want to. And that's I think just really energizing. And I like David White, and of course I love Mary Oliver. I know lots of people have poems of hers that are their touchstone. I almost think about it in a way that I think like, is that cool enough of me to like Mary Oliver? But I don't care because, you do not have to be good, as the first line of a poem is just so simple and blunt and magnetic. At last night's Poetry Unlocked event, Tom Singleton and Abby Frucht read totally different writers, totally different kinds of poets. I was thoroughly mesmerized by both of them. And then the open mic afterward had 13 people who read, which normally has like 5 or 6. And I loved every single poem. Like, I just left thinking how lucky I am to not just have to wait till the next issue of Rattle comes out, or not just wait until something new is uploaded to Button Poetry Online or whatever. I get to hang out with people who are doing interesting, funny, dark, peaceful, all the things that you can think of in a poem. I get to see them once a month at least. And I emailed one of the poets last night that I heard last night to say, could I please use your poem in my classroom, because I try to keep a new poem out every few days on this podium at the door for them to grab. And I just loved it. It was just so wacky and weird. It was like a science fiction / Bible story poem, which I just thought was so great. I love collecting poems from all these different journals and sources and email listservs and stuff that I can, easily serve up to my students to read. It's just so rewarding and fun to have those people right around me all the time that I can lean on and look to. And there's really something special about knowing someone whose poem you liked and poetry you like reading, because then you get to talk to each other and know each other on a human level. And even, some of the names I mentioned before, like Devin, who I'm pen pals with, I'm not pen pals with Megan Merchant or Francesca Bell, but we have exchanged emails about their poems and about writing, and they're just so personable and encouraging. And some of these people you wind up connected to on social media, and you start to help them grieve their losses and celebrate their joys. And it's just such a particular special thing that I think happens, I'm guessing, more in the world of poetry than it probably does in the world of like authors who all know each other, who write novels. But I do think that there's something just very uniquely connective about it, which is great because writing can be such a solitary thing. So yeah, those connections are huge to me and just completely keep my little writer fish pond stocked and ready to go. Student the other day, I had a bunch of students trying to write poems, and she goes, I'm sorry, but so what is a poem? I said, this is kind of one of these questions that people are still sort of debating, in many ways. There's things that we're pretty sure we know are poems, and then there's other things that we're like, well, I'm not really sure if that's a poem, where you a novel's a novel, and if it's a shorter one, it's a novella, and you're pretty sure this is an essay over here. And I said, poetry is kind of funny that way. There was a TED art video, I think it's TEDx art, that had this beautiful animation. It's really short. There was an image they used saying poetry is like literature with all the water wrung out. And it was saying how, you're basically kind of like distilling things down to just the few glimpses, glances, and pieces you want people to see, so that then they can build their impression in their mind. And I always really loved that image. And so, when I'm talking to students about poetry, I'm saying, this is your chance, this is your place to communicate a feeling, a frustration, an excitement, a joy, an observation, without having to go on and on and on about it over several pages and several paragraphs, with an intro and a thesis statement and a conclusion that reiterates those things in reverse. And I said, you get to break rules about language and punctuation. You get to decide where the tension and pauses should be in your own writing and inflection. And so I don't know if this answers the question well enough, but I have to say, about a year and a half ago, I had a student who we were reading a novel in verse called Keisha's House by Helen Frost, and it's written all in sestina form. And one of my students raises his hand. He goes, I'm sorry. I just don't like poetry. I'm sorry. And I said, it's okay. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, you just haven't met the poems you needed to meet yet, And he said, I just don't think I can like it. It's just, I'm always confused, and I don't know, it just is too hard for me. And so I made it kind of my little tiny project in the background I started pulling poems, over a couple of days for him to read. And I stapled them together and I gave them to him. And he's like, so I should read this? And I said, yeah, go for it. And he read them for a few minutes during work time, and he called me over and he's like, some of these are not that bad. Some of these, I actually like some of these. And I said, well, tell me which ones. And he pointed, he's like, well, I like this one because it's about soccer. And I was like, I know, you like soccer. And this one's about Christmas. I like Christmas. And I said, I know you like Christmas. And I had included a number of Pat Mora poems in the packet because he's Mexican-American and very proud of his heritage. And then he pointed to one of the last poems. The last poem in the packet was one that she had written in 2 languages, and in both English and Spanish. And he said, this one, I really love this one. I said, yeah. Did you notice it was last? And he said, did you know? Did you know that I would like that one the best? And I said, well, I thought there was a chance. And with him, my explanation of what is poetry was just to say, look, here's a place where you can talk about these hard things without needing anyone's permission, without having to worry if people are going to do a TLDR on it, on your social media post or whatever. She's talking about some hard things and some heavy things. And he said, yeah, you're right. And so I think poetry can be a space that people can shape to whatever brevity, whatever expansive, wordy, lengthy spooling thing. I mean, it can be all of those things. Many people, I think, see it as a challenging form because they don't know exactly what the writer was thinking as they wrote it. I kind of have learned to see it as the opposite. I think it's a very freeing form because, first of all, again, as I said before, you're not obligated to know. You're not obligated to walk away feeling like, oh, I know exactly what they meant. It kind of goes back to that old adage that like the writing you do isn't complete until someone reads it and then makes of it what they want or need or whatever. I don't really know how good of an answer that is to what do I see as poetry, but it's the one that works for me. It's the one that sometimes works for my students. I've only been submitting to publication for a couple of years, and I'm really intermittent and inconsistent and sporadic about it. Like, I try to tell myself I'm going to try to send, a few things out every month. I try to make it so that I have a little spreadsheet and I at least say if I submitted something, and I want it to say the month at the beginning of the date every month, and I haven't always been able to even stick to that. And it's symbolic, really more than anything, but I just decided to, without really knowing what I was doing at all, just starting to like fall down the rabbit hole of the database on the Poets and Writers website, and kind of learning more about which journals are looking for what, and which journals I go to read on my own just because I want to, and so I've had about 20 poems accepted over the last couple of years, but to maybe like a dozen journals. Maybe a little more than that, I'm not sure. I've had something in Bramble, which is a Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets publication. Other journals were Rig Welter and Poets Reading the News and New Verse News, which totally makes me kind of chuckle every time I think of it, because that poem was a poem I wrote on my couch while I watched the Packer game, during which Aaron Rodgers broke his collarbone a couple years ago. The games are long. My mom was a diehard Packer fan, so I've just like kind of inherited it from her, but you got to do other things while you watch a Packer game. And so I had my little Chromebook out there, and Troy Aikman said something like, boy, you just hate to see one of your marquee, and he used a word that wasn't for a person. It was like units or something. You hate to see one of your marquee whatevers go down, and boy, that really hurts the franchise. And it just struck me how I knew what he meant, and he didn't mean it maliciously, but how the players really are just pieces in a machine. They're pieces in somebody's fantasy football spread. They're pieces in somebody's investment plan. They're pieces and it just made me think of how they're just like the modern gladiators, of our time. And so as I'm watching the game and we're getting more and more reports of Aaron Rodgers' broken collarbone, I'm just writing like line after line after line after line. And after revising it, I send it off to New Verse News thinking, there's no way he's going to want this wacky compare the NFL to ancient Rome poem, and he did, and I thought, oh well, okay, anything's possible in poetry if that's true, and so those are some of the places that I have some things, but I don't have a chapbook. I haven't attempted to try to collect things together for that, but I would like to. It's kind of a fuzzy, nebulous, sometime goal that I have. And I think if I did, the one or the first one I would try to do would probably be about my job. I write a lot about my students, just about the process of working with them, because obviously working with young people in general is a really fascinating and challenging and fraught thing. But I work with young adults who are struggling. They are at risk of a wide range of problems. And working with them, you would think like, where would a person find time if you're spending, 50 hours a week there with them? But I sometimes have thought, what would I write about if I didn't hang out with them? I easily half of everything I've written has been about them or working with young people, or just the challenges we face in a school setting now that we worry about, active shooter drills and kids in dangerous states, and like I said, kids passing away before their time. So most of the poems that I've had published at first were about those things. Now the most recent batch have been more about, navigating relationships and realizing that even though you're 40, you don't know everything. Like, whoa, I thought that's not how this worked. But that's it. That's the extent of me as a published person. I do feel like my biggest pull in the work of poet is with young people. I really am amazed and fascinated, impressed with what they can do. Not just the students who already see themselves that way. I mean, I always have students who already by default when I meet them see themselves as creative or creatives. But what's been really amazing and impressive to me is seeing students who don't see themselves that way and who don't do those things tap into it. Like find the willingness and sort of the courage to attempt that. And so I've thought for a while that I would love to be sort of just the facilitator or the moderator of a young adult writing group. You know, kids who are not in high school anymore and maybe haven't gone on to college or haven't majored in a written art, but who want to keep that side of themselves alive. So I would love to find the time and the capacity to do that. My creative writing classes now, I just asked them this week, like, okay, you guys, what if we had our own public behind the mic reading of the stuff you guys have been working on this semester? And the majority of them are like, yes, let's do it. So I see, I don't know if it's fair to say a need, but I see a niche maybe for young people who want more opportunities like that, to embrace them, because we all had to chuckle at the first conference, Fellowship of Poets conference I went to in fall. Most of the people are older than me, and they don't deny it or try to hide it. You know, they're like, yep, we are retired, we are who we are, we have time for this. There was one very young man who came. He isn't in an MFA program. He is a sheet metal apprentice, and he is coming to talk to my students about how to be that, how to be someone who has this vocation over here and pays their bills this way, but also does this other thing which seems incongruous and incompatible and unrelated. And we are constantly putting ourselves into these categories of like, oh, well, you know, I do this, so I can't be a writer. I'm a writer, so I can't do this over here. I just would really, I think my larger vision of things to put my time towards as a writer and poet in the future would be the things that help young people to tap into that. And so I don't know exactly what those forms will take for sure. I kind of keep letting them reveal themselves to me. And so each kind of little phase of the journey of trying to do what I'm doing helps me, I think, see better, and getting to see what they can do and see what their needs are helps me to figure that out. But beyond that, I can't say that I'm not pining to be an editor someday or to start my own journal. I'm very much a one step at a time person as it comes to this stuff, so. Well, the things I love where I live, you know, in Appleton, I love the sidewalk poetry program. I have so many sidewalk poems in my neighborhood specifically. One of the poems is in front of some dear friends' house. They're not poets or particularly into poetry, but they agreed to have a poem when they were asked to put on their sidewalk, and the topic of it was, you know, our friends are the family we choose, you know, and they have been such great friends to me that I thought, well, how perfect that that poem wound up in front of their house. So I love, love, love that project, because it just literally is right in front of you as you're walking down the street, like, hey, here's a poem. And to have that level of daily life integration of poems, I think, is just awesome. And anything that does that, I think, is great. I love that my students subscribe to YouTube channels that are devoted to poetry and cheer each other on for writing poetry. They don't roll their eyes at each other like, oh, him with his poems again. You know, they see it as a relevant and real way to get through a day, get through a hard thing, to celebrate something. I always have loved that our nation has a poet laureate, but I also feel really grateful that Wisconsin has a poet laureate program, and hopefully it will continue to have one. I mean, I kind of love the idea of these, the poet laureate of Madison, the poet laureate of Milwaukee, this idea that we have sort of a chief poet, you know, for each municipality that a person calls their home. I really love the idea of seeing poetry as just a natural part of daily life. In the same way that you see sometimes people get out like a guitar at a campfire in summer, nobody questions it, like, oh, so-and-so knows how to play guitar, let's listen to him sing or sing along. And it would be, I think, just great if poems were seen as an accessible, natural part of those kinds of any kind of gathering, really, you know, of people, but also for your mental health. I mean, I've joked with myself in my own head about how I'll be writing and writing and writing, and this poem comes out and this poem comes out, and I'll realize something about myself or my life and go, well, my poems knew before I knew. Like, how did that happen? Anything that unlocks that ability for people, no matter who they are. I think really beautiful, useful poems that help people cope and help people commemorate things can come from anyone, really, with just the right circumstances and the right support. And so anything we could do in our community that continues that. This first poem is called Unwriting Rules, and I'm pretty sure it's coming out soon. I picked it to read for this because it kind of touched on that question of, are we allowed to be writers? Are we allowed to be poets? I think there's a big imposter syndrome that comes with any arts-based thing you do, where you think like, oh, well, I'm not really this person. And it's just struck me one day just how very silly that is, how understandable where it comes from, but how silly it is. So why do we believe that there are rules about how the designations poet or writer or creative are applied? I suppose this belief aligns with our system, requiring licenses to legally perform services and degrees to be trusted to do the job right. Treat the patient, draw up the contract, design the construction, fix what's broken. And rightly so. But the tops of the cottonwood don't need permission to be heard as music, or to have their natural impulse to sway and whisper their song classified as pleasing to hear. Just think of how much time has perhaps been wasted on wondering if one has permission to be instead of just being. I know I spoke earlier about how much I think about and write about my students, and this past fall a number of them were allowed an opportunity to partner with the Fox Cities Performing Arts Center to be in a small workshop co-led by me and Tara Polcati, writing out whatever version of their own stories they would be willing to write about and possibly share. Halfway through the program, they got to go see Hamilton and see the ways in which those stories are told, and then kind of come back to the workshop, you know, juiced up and ready to keep going. And then the whole experience culminated with them going back to the PAC, to the Founders Room, and then the Kimberly Clark Theater to go up on a stage behind a mic. Friends and family, board members, PAC people, cast of Hamilton came to hear them. And a number of them stepped out of comfort zones that they did not think they would be able to, but just kind of were encouraged to go for it by all of us at Central. And they did so well, and they were just so impressive to watch. In the days after that, I just kind of kept having this, you know, glowy pride in them buzzing through me. And so this poem is literally dedicated to them and to that experience, but it has really, the poem itself has stayed with me. I think it's applicable to anyone who has stepped outside of their comfort zone or been unsure of themselves, in a way similar to the last poem. And it's called Every Single One of You. Every single one of you has wished the floor would swallow them up, felt underdressed for life, for the level of strife making them flee in the night, no coat, no light, not quite protected from the elements of surprise or deception or unmet expectations. Every single one of you has frayed edges, a split in the hem meant to hold you together, loose stitches at the seam of even the favorite threads in your mental closet. Every single one of you has thought, but I have nothing to wear, or also nowhere to go where I am known, where I can show my true design, my style, threads of me distinct and intertwined to make a pattern so few get to see. Every single one of you, though, has intricate golden and silver fibers interwoven, which cannot be stolen, cannot be completely broken. It makes a cape or flag or robe that is yours alone to fearlessly flaunt or shyly show, and just standing up to the microphone caused that flag to flow behind you or cloak to drop to the floor below you, smooth and slow with the elegance and dignity that speaks louder than your trauma or your tragedy. And lucky me, I got to see it, see you flying free, if even for a moment only. Still, that moment is a stitch in the time of your life as it unfolds from the bolt of cloth, not only woven for you, but woven by you. You'll be whole in the end, then alter yourself again, because every single one of you was not meant to break, just bend. Hi, I'm Katie Chicquette Adams, and I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin. My suggestion is, now that the weather is nice, get out there, go for a walk. Chances are very good if you walk around Appleton, you will walk literally right up to a poem. and it will keep you company for a couple minutes on your walk, and that's a great way to celebrate Poetry Month.